Well, that's all, folks. We have made it to the very last episode, the series finale for Better Call Saul, Saul Gone. And it was perfect. In my opinion, it was the perfect series finale for this show. It satisfied everything that I was hoping it would. It resolved all of the unresolved conflicts. Going into this, and if you saw my breakdown for Waterworks, heard me say that I was hoping for a couple of things. One, that Jimmy would atone. Two, we would get some sort of closure between these two characters. And three, that they would be okay. Not just survive, but be okay. And we got all three of those things. And it was a beautiful finale. I enjoyed every second of it. And I cried my eyes out. I bawled my eyes out through it, as evidenced by my home security. Yeah, this one made me an emotional wreck. Hi, my name is Courtney, and you're watching Courtney's Reviews. This episode hit on all the feels. It hit me in all the feels, and it was also the emotions of the show ending, coming to an end. It is my favorite TV series. So I have a lot to say about this one, and I hope you'll join me for my breakdown of the Better Call Saul series finale, Saul Gone. So, like Ebenezer Scrooge, Jimmy McGill is visited by three ghosts from his past who all help him realize what his real regrets are and put him on a path toward change. So I was teasing out my ideas a little bit in the conversation that I had with Anton Jackson TV, which if you didn't see, I will link that down below. But my ideas are more matured at this point, and I want to start by going chronologically. And the reason for that is because I think the way that they edited in these scenes adds so much context to the story being told. So what comes immediately before and what follows it helps us better understand why these conversations with Mike, with Walt, and with Chuck are placed specifically where they are placed in this episode. So we begin the cold open with Mike, and Jimmy and Mike are slogging through the desert during the same time as the events of Bagman. And I mentioned this in my conversation with Anton, that at first I wasn't sure if this was like a mirage, if this was fantasy, or if this was real. I do believe that all these scenes actually did take place. Now, with the Mike scene, of course, the significance of that is this discussion about what would you do if you had a time machine and you could go back and change something. And that idea, that concept of being able to change the past is one that looms over the entire episode. And of course, you can't change your past, but you can change your path, as Chuck tells Jimmy later. Mike first mentions a date in December of 2001, which I believe is probably the date that Maddie died. But then he revises that and decides to go back even further to March 17th, 1984, the date he took his first bride. Now, in 5-0 in season 1, we get all this backstory on Maddie and what happened to his son Maddie, and how Mike was able to avenge his son's death in the sort of cartelian? In this cartelian sense of justice, eye for an eye, sangre por sangre. And Mike notes that he wants to go back and that date when he took his first bribe, presumably so that he wouldn't take that bribe, because had he not taken that bribe, he would have never become a dirty cop, and he would have never persuaded his son to take the bribe and become a dirty cop, which ultimately resulted in his death.
He put me up on a pedestal. And I had to show him that I was down in the gutter with the rest of them. Broke my boy. I broke my boy.
Now, Jimmy says that he would like to go back to 1965 and take $1 million and invest it into Berkshire Hathaway, Warren Buffett's company. So by today's standards, he would be a billionaire, possibly trillionaire.
That's it, buddy.
What else?
Nothing you change.
And this I think parallels nicely with some of the other conversations that they had during the desert in the episode of Bagman, specifically when Jimmy is lying down and says he wants to give up. And Mike tells Jimmy he knows what he's doing it for. And then Jimmy realizes that he's doing it for Kim as well. And of course, Kim is his raison d'etre, right? She is his jury of one. She is the love of his life. She is the reason for his redemption. Before moving on, there are a few other things I wanted to mention about this scene. So Jimmy says to Mike, we're sitting on $7 million here. We can take it. And this reminded me a lot of a scene from season 1, actually the last scene of the season finale, Marco, when Jimmy stops to talk to Mike and says, we had all this money. It's the money that they recovered from the Kettlemans. Why didn't we take it? And Mike says to him something similar that he says in this episode, I knew what I was doing for. It's not mine to take. And this is part of Jimmy's hubris is believing that money would make a difference, that money would bring happiness. And it's taken him a long time to learn the lesson that it doesn't, that money is not the source of happiness. Of course, we see this happen with the Sandpiper settlement. He gets the payout, but at what cost, right? Howard dies and he loses the love of his life. Kim leaves. And then we see something again happen here where he makes all the money in the world. He says, he even notes that he made millions off of working with Walter White. And it's very fitting that the very first scene following this one after the title sequence is him sitting in a dumpster, cradling his diamonds. It's somehow fitting that he keeps his diamonds in a Band-Aid tin, right? So the Band-Aid is something you put on a wound, but it's a superficial prophylactic, right? So like if it's a serious deep wound, you're going to need to go internally. You're going to need to treat the infection internally. So he has this Band-Aid tin of diamonds that he falsely equates with happiness and falsely ascribes value to, right? So that's not what's really lacking in his life. It's not for want of money, right? That's not his problem. And as Mike, I think, was trying to convey to him in the desert and in the ticket booth in Marco, is that you have to know what you're doing everything for. And Jimmy still hasn't quite figured it out yet. But there are many clues throughout this episode about what the correct path is. So I'll talk more about that later, of course. But did you guys notice when he is leaving his apartment, the shape of the sidewalk? So this makes me think a little bit about the line that Chuck says to him, that if you're not happy with the way things are headed, you can always go back and change your path. And look at the shape of this path that he's taking here. So of course it's not his intention when he leaves, like he is trying to escape, but the correct path is back to Kim. And to do that, he has to get back to McGill first. So after he is captured, we see him taken into the station, and his first phone call is to Cinnabon, which I think is really interesting, right? That was his number one concern at the moment, was making sure that the store would be okay and that they would have proper management. Still sort of thinking through that and what that tells us about his character. But moving on, what I find really interesting about this scene is when he is in the cell and he seems defeated. He's slouched on the floor, and then he sees the writing on the wall, right? And the writing on the wall, of course, perhaps a callback to SG was here, something he inscribed by the dumpster. in the mall. And the line, "My lawyer will ream your ass," right, of course, makes him laugh. And the way I interpret that scene is that he remembers who he is. He remembers the magic that he possesses. Saul Goodman. He is Saul Goodman. And that, of course, gets the wheels turning. He asks for another phone call. And in one of the lighter moments, one of the more comedic scenes, he calls Oakley. And the way Oakley drops what he's holding reminds me a little bit of the end of Breaking Bad, when Walt shows up and his neighbor drops her groceries. So this sort of shock, right? And then Jimmy, like Walt in that scene, are very casual, and they're like, whatever, no big deal, like. And also the way like Walt is super laid back when he walks into Gretchen and Elliot Schwartz's house too, and how people are so stunned by them and afraid of them and awestruck by them, and they're just like, yeah. But another thing I wanted to note about this scene is when Jimmy says to Oakley, "Bang bang," and "bang bang" is made me think of the finger guns at the end, "bang bang," but also in the bus chants when the prisoners are singing, "Better bang call bang Saul bang bang."
Better call Saul.
So he calls Oakley and he's going to work his Saul magic, and he's feeling himself again. He's going to shoot lightning from his fingertips. And in the following scene, the scene with Marie, there's a lot to unpack here. So when he's first walking down and you see that quick glimpse of Marie and she turns her head, like my soul left my body. I was like shocked to see her, and I've said this elsewhere, but this was a very hard-hitting scene for me. So he's sitting in there, they're reading off the government, or reading off the charges. They're offering him a 30-year deal, and he asks them to invite in Mrs. Schrader. And when she comes in, and then she starts talking about, Hank, and how his death and Steve's death have left this void in their lives. And this is when I started to cry. And I've noted elsewhere that I wasn't particularly fond of the Schraders in Breaking Bad, but Hank was, he was one of the good guys and really didn't deserve what happened to him. And seeing Marie's pain in this way, I think was a helpful reminder to all of us of just how horrid the crimes in Breaking Bad were, and why Saul, Jimmy, is facing these charges. Then, of course, what does he do? He spins this half-truth, right, of how he was also a victim. So he says, "Mrs. Schrader, you and your husband were both victims, but so was I." And he recounts the factual story of his introduction to Walter White. And of course, we know better. And as we see in the court scene later, he wasn't terrified for very long. But as he tells the government, he only needs one juror to believe him. He just needs one. And that reasonable doubt that might be raised could be enough to exonerate him. So of course, the government decides to go forward with negotiations with him. And we see that he pleads it down to 7.5 years. But I wanted to focus a little bit on the line, "I only need one, just one to believe me." And of course, he's talking about just one juror should it go to trial. He would just need one juror, right? Just one juror to hang up the jury. But of course, in hindsight, it's foreshadowing for how the only juror that really matters is Kim. And he confesses for an audience of one for Kim. But I'll talk more about that in a little. So as he's negotiating and coming up with all these stipulations for, things that he wants in this deal, so that he'll go to a specific prison, and then he requests a pint of Blue Bell mint chocolate chip ice cream. And this part reminded me a little bit of Mr. Kettleman and his coffee. Like, will Jimmy ever actually get his mint chocolate chip ice cream? Will Mr. Kettleman ever get a sip of coffee? So just to remind you, we see Jimmy at one point eating a mint chocolate chip ice cream cone as he's walking down the street, and that's when Nacho pulls up and tells him to get in and takes him to go see Lalo. This is right after Crazy 8 got picked up, and they want him to go in and feed some information to Crazy 8. And then, of course, following the events in Bad Choice Road, when Lalo shows up at their apartment and they go to stay at the hotel, they order ice cream. And as Kim is fixing Jimmy's ice cream, he says, hold the mint chocolate chip, because, you know, a negative association there. But here he's asking for the pints of mint chocolate chip to have every Friday for the duration of his 7.5-year term. And he'll never get that mint chocolate chip ice cream. But it is a sacrifice that he makes. And as he's trying to negotiate for the ice cream, though, that is, he wants to give them information about Howard's disappearance and death. And that's when he learns that Kim actually already came forward and told the truth. And you can see it on his face. It is shock. It is grief. It is a whole mixture of emotions painted on his face. And that leads into our next flashback, our next ghost, Walt. And the way that the Walt scene picks up, Walt says he's going to put a stop to it.
I'm putting a stop to it.
And putting a stop to it is exactly what Jimmy is going to do to his own plea deal. So this could be a little bit of linguistic foreshadowing. I'm going to put a stop to it. Of course, what Walt is speaking about is the clicking sound that the hot water heater pipes are making. And this is also a very loaded scene. So I'm sure most of you, if you've seen Breaking Bad, you recognize this space. This is the space under Ed's vacuum repair shop. So this is at the end events of Breaking Bad, right before Jimmy leaves town for Omaha and Walt leaves town for New Hampshire. So the crap has hit the fan, right? And they've had to vacuum themselves out and they have to bunk up for a little bit. So we get to see this little moment in time as they're waiting to be relocated. And I want to unpack some of the dialogue here because I think it's interesting, right? So Walt, of course, is, tinkering with things as he does. He is a fixer, and we see him like at one point in the hospital, the table's a little unsteady, it's a little wobbly, so he takes out like one of those little subscription cards from a magazine, folds it up and puts it under the table to stop it from wobbling. Of course, he fixed his own hot water heater in his house, and discovers he's got dry rot in his floorboards. So this was, in line with his character, but more than that, the dialogue is really, really relevant to what is going on with Jimmy. So Walt says, the flame is lighting, but it keeps going out, as he's describing the problem with the hot water heater.
The flame is lighting, and then it keeps going out.
And I take this to be something of a metaphor for Jimmy and Kim, right? Like the flame is still there between them, but it keeps getting put out by circumstance, right? So like by what happened with Howard, by the fact that she moved away to Florida, by the fact that he became Saul Goodman, and all of the other events that happened in between in the past 6 years, right? So the flame is lighting, but it keeps going out. And of course, this foreshadows what we see in at the end of the episode. And he says that he thinks the problem is he needs a new thermocouple.
A thermocouple is corroded. Okay, I got it.
So a thermocouple, I was again thinking of this as perhaps a metaphor for Jimmy and Kim. They are a hot couple, hot bodies, and that flame does burn eternal. So he just needs to repair the damaged thermocouple, perhaps. And so this again, perhaps foreshadowing for what Jimmy's going to do. He's going to repair the piece that is missing, or the faulty piece. And then, of course, the faulty piece is him. He's going to make an amends. He's going to redeem himself. And Walt also says there's no reason to stay down here without hot water. And this made me think about how Jimmy's about to put himself intentionally and voluntarily into hot water, legally speaking. And so then Jimmy asks Walt, what would you do if you had a time machine? And you get this like sort of fun little back and forth banter between them where Walt gets to, show off his scientific knowledge and everything. And he's like, and then he calls him out. He's like, what you're actually asking about is regrets. If you want to know about regrets, just ask about regrets. And so Jimmy's like, yeah, sure, fine, regrets. And then interestingly, Walt cites gray matter, right? So the business he started while he was a grad student with Elliot and Gretchen, and walking away from that. And just as a reminder of where we are in Walt's life at this exact moment, that's his regret is mind-blowing, right? So shortly before the events of this conversation, his brother-in-law was murdered, right? His whole life has been blown up. He got into that horrible fight with his wife, kidnapped his daughter, and Ozymandias, right? And he has to go on the run. So like he has destroyed his whole life. He's destroyed his family, and his biggest regret is gray matter. Seriously. So it kind of reminds me a little bit of what Jimmy says at the beginning in the cold open with Mike, right? Like that he wishes he could go back and invest money. So he's driven by the wrong thing. And then another thing that I thought was really interesting about this conversation that they have, and this is something we've seen with Jimmy before. So Jimmy listens to Mike's advice throughout the series, but he often misunderstands it or misconstrues it, and then he'll often try to give that same advice to someone else. For example, Kim, right? So I think a bad choice road, right? So Mike tells, this is following the events of Batman. And Mike tells Jimmy, you're one day you're gonna wake up and you're gonna realize you haven't even thought about it, right? And you're gonna know you can move on. And he also mentions that the thing about bad choice roads, right? Like, so the decisions you make can put you on a bad choice road. So in Bad Choice Road, in the apartment scene, right before Lalo comes in, Jimmy and Kim are having that conversation. Kim tells Jimmy she quit Schweikart and Coakley, and Jimmy's trying to repeat what Mike had told him about bad choice roads, but of course he mixes it up a little bit. It's not very effective. Following the events of what happened with Howard in Plan and Execution, we see Jimmy and Kim talking about, or we see Jimmy and Kim in that like shoddy hotel room, and Jimmy's like, oh, one day you're gonna wake up and you're gonna realize you haven't even thought about it. And you're going to know you can, live with yourself. You can move on. So again, he's parroting advice or pearls of wisdom that Mike gave him, but he's getting it kind of wrong. So in this one, right, like he was listening to what Mike had to say about regrets, or perhaps thinking about what Mike had to say about regrets in the desert. And here he, with Walt though, is thinking, okay, so like maybe like the first time I took a slip and fall. And so like right when you think that maybe this is like actual real introspection and reflection, and thinking about how like being able to pinpoint the moment when he became Slippin' Jimmy. But it's not because he became Slippin' Jimmy because of like, pursuing that kind of lifestyle. It's because he actually hurt his knee taking that slip and fall when he was 22 in Cicero, right? So he's almost there, but not quite yet. And so something else that I wanted to note about this scene that I thought was really interesting. So as they're sitting on their cots facing each other and talking about their regrets, there's a moment where we see light reflected in Walter's glasses, this orange light. And I can't really directly pinpoint the source of that light by looking at the rest of the scene, but it reminded me of the moment when we see Gus in 609. When he's at the pool with Don Eladio and the Salamancas, and we see the fire burning in his glasses, take that to be a metaphor of his hatred that burns for the Salamancas and what drives him to want revenge against them. But it also kind of recontextualized a scene from the last episode, from the last scene of the last episode, Waterworks, for me, when Jimmy opens up Marion's laptop and he sees his own commercial. We see the orange light reflected in his glasses. And the orange light in this scene with Walt, as he's thinking about gray matter, it's like their hatred burning, right? The hatred, the regret, the outrage that the feeling that they've been wronged, and they want justice for this wrong. They want to right these wrongs that they perceive. So with Gus, it's wanting revenge for Max's death. For Walt, it's regretting walking away from gray matter and giving up this money. And thinking, as I said, it recontextualized the Saul scene for me. I think he hasn't quite realized it yet, but it is the hatred of this character. It is the hatred of Saul and what embracing Saul has done to his life. And as we see, he decides to throw Saul off, and he becomes Jimmy McGill again. So thinking back to that little M in the pathway, one half of Wexler McGill, he's going to return back to himself. And the way that this scene is sandwiched, right? This Walt scene, I think, just helps us better understand how he's coming to this realization, right? So how he's perhaps reflecting on this moment in time with Walter and finally starting to understand what his real regrets are. And the last thing that Walt says to him in that scene is, "You were always like this." Reminds me, and I'm sure it reminded most of you, and it certainly reminded Jimmy of Chuck's condemnation of him. "You're slipping, Jimmy. You'll never change," right? And so if we are to think of these flashbacks as happening like real time in Jimmy's mind, right? So he would just learned that Kim confessed. And he just got like the sweetheart deal of the century, that he's only going to have to serve 7.5 years for all of these crimes. And thinking about Kim and thinking about what Saul has cost him. And so Saul, in this instance, has gotten him this deal, but what has Saul cost him? And then in the very next scene is when we get him on the plane. And I think it's interesting that he's looking out through the window, and our first shot of the plane is of a river sneaking through an otherwise barren landscape. So all three of these flashbacks have to do with water. As I've been saying for some time now, Jimmy is strongly associated with water. So we get the pool, the water in the desert with Mike. So again, water in a sort of barren landscape with Walt, the hot water heater getting fixed. And then we see this this river snaking through, and rivers are a form of irrigation, right? And so if you saw my breakdown of waterworks, right, I talked about the two different definitions of irrigation in terms of Kim's situation, right? So she works at a sprinkler store where they sell irrigation products, and also what she does to herself. So she irrigates a wound. That is a painful process to clean out a wound, but it is essential for healing. And Kim, as we see, confesses. So the fact that we see this river here, this irrigation, maybe that's makes him think of Kim, or it is the water in the barren landscape, right? It is the water that saves his life. It is the thing that makes him human. And this is when I think the idea comes to him to throw the deal and to also throw off his Saul suit. We see him stop Oakley as Oakley's walking by, and he's and Jimmy, of course, is sitting next to the marshal and asks about Kim and what everything means for her. And Oakley says, she confessed. It's not even just the DA that's her problem. It's actually Cheryl Hamlin who is her problem. And she gave Cheryl her notarized sworn affidavit. So Cheryl can use that to file a civil suit, right? And so then Oakley goes to the bathroom, and I think that's when Jimmy really understands what he needs to do as well. So he wants to follow Kim's suit. And this idea of like the way that they actually call Cheryl Hamlin's widow, and the way that they talk about both Marie Schrader and Steve Gomez's wife Blanca as widows. I think this idea of it's like some sort of restitution for the widows, this confession, giving the actual victims peace of mind and what they're actually owed. In the airplane, when you hear the engines tick on, That's when Jimmy gets his idea. So his engines are going. And so, of course, when Oakley comes back from the bathroom, Jimmy stops him again and says that he's got new information that's going to make their toes curl, and it implicates Kim. And then in the next scene is Kim. And we know that this is about a month following the events of Waterworks. She's still working at the irrigation place. She's having lunch. Looks like probably something like another tuna sandwich, maybe with Miracle Whip. And one of her coworkers asks her about this restaurant. What do you think? And again, Kim is not expressing any sorts of opinions. And then we see her under an irrigation poster, so connecting her to that moment with Jimmy. And we see her get up, and she goes to a legal, like free legal aid place. And this was the moment this was also a heavy moment for me. I started crying just because I was hoping for something like this. She may never be able to practice again. It really depends on what happens with Cheryl. Maybe sometime in the future she would be able to, but at least she can volunteer her time doing something she loves, that she really truly loves. So this was a deeply moving scene to watch. And then, of course, she gets the phone call from Suzanne Erickson, who is calling to give her a heads up that Jimmy has some damning testimony against her. And of course, this is just Jimmy's way of flushing Kim out. It is a manipulative tactic to get her to go to Albuquerque because he wants her to watch his show. And one other thing I thought was an interesting little detail in the Kim legal services scene is that the lawyer who is running it is wearing these earrings that to me looked a lot like lifesavers that you would see like a lifeguard throw to someone drowning. So it is a lifesaver for Kim. She's being thrown a raft here to help her stay afloat. I actually went back to watch Granite State in Breaking Bad, which is the penultimate episode in Breaking Bad, because I wanted to see the scene that takes place at the same time as the Walt flashback that we got in this episode, just to remind myself. And there was some interesting dialogue in that scene that I think really feeds well into the scene that follows Kim receiving the phone call from Suzanne Erickson.
What? Stay. Face the music. Hey, I mean, how much time have you got left? You walk in with your head held high, you'll be the John Dillinger of the Metropolitan Detention Center. How bad is that?
So we see Jimmy walking down the hallway with his head held high like John Dillinger, taking the very advice that he had given to Walt. And this is the only scene in the whole episode where we get extra diegetic music. I mean, in terms of like a needle drop, like an actual song, as opposed to the score that Dave Porter wrote for this episode. And I got chills at this moment. And I turned to the people I was watching with and I said, "It's showtime." So it was cool to hear him say that as he sat down. It's showtime. And yes, he started crying again. Okay, I cried. I cried a lot. I did not stop crying after this point. So a couple things about this scene. It's such a great scene. I don't really want to summarize it. I'm sure you all have it burned into your memories by this point. But there are a couple of things that I did want to point out. So as he sits down, he looks back at Kim at one point, and we get this shot through like the little partition that is behind Jimmy and Oakley, and then the prosecution. And we see her through this cross that looks like crosshairs, right? So it looks like, like Jimmy has her in his sights. And of course, Kim is there because she thinks that he's going to say something damning about her. But you'll notice that the sights are off center. So it's a misfire or a misdirect. And certainly at this point, I think probably most of the audience has figured out that he's not really doing anything to harm her. He just wanted her to come and witness this. And then we see him ask to approach the bench. And he starts telling the same story that he told Marie, right? And it's verbatim, word for word, the defense that he was intending to use had this gone to trial, right? That recounting how he met Walter White and framing himself as a victim. And this is when he comes clean, and he keeps looking back at Kim to make sure that she's watching this. So he confesses to everything, and how he enabled Walt. And then after he clarifies Walt could not have done any of this without him, he looks back at Kim and he sees that her face is still stoic. It's still unmoved. And that's when he decides to come forward and also mention Howard and Chuck. And what he has to say about Chuck, I love how the camera pulls back and you see the exit sign, you hear the buzzing. Of course, that's a callback to chicanery. And of course, the electricity sound being associated with Chuck, and also that it's an exit sign. This is Jimmy's exit. And he says that, he was limited and I tried, but I could have tried more. And I hurt him when I had the chance. And he confesses to how he got his insurance canceled. And this is something that was previously unknown to anyone but him. He never has, at least to our knowledge, ever shared this with Kim, that he did this. And so he says, I took away the one thing he lived for, and then he killed himself. And then we get this shot of Kim, and she tilts her head back and she looks up. And I think I mentioned this in my conversation with Anton, but I think this is significant for several reasons. I think this is something that she identifies with personally, right? It was a self-imposed punishment that she took the law away from herself. She withdrew from the bar and moved to Florida and essentially killed herself, metaphorically anyway. She withdrew from life. And of course, I think this has great significance for her because she was very invested in what happened with Jimmy and Chuck, and was concerned about Jimmy for never processing what happened to his brother. And obviously that is a open wound that Jimmy carries around, of everything that happened in his history with Chuck. So I think that that look up is she's overcome with emotion and she's trying not to show too much emotion. And then when Jimmy says the name's McGill, if you didn't cry, I don't know what's wrong with you, because wow, what a moment. So in my breakdown for fun and games, right, as I was talking about how like all of the characters came face to face with who they really were and reconciled with themselves. We saw Mike do it. We saw Gus do it. And we saw Kim do it as well, right? They came to terms with who they were and made a decision, right? So Gus and Mike came to the understanding that he is one of the gangsters, as Manuel Varga tells him. Gus came to realize that he can't have intimate relationships as long as he's, on this quest for revenge against the Salamancas. And Kim realized she couldn't continue this relationship with Jimmy because it was harmful. They were hurting other people. And I said in that breakdown that Jimmy was the only one that had not yet come to terms with who he is. And he finally does here. He finally accepts who he is, and he is Slippin' Jimmy. And when Oakley says to him, what was that about your brother? That's not even a crime. And Jimmy says, yes, it was. I think, again, this speaks to like the different kinds of justice that I've been talking about on my channel, right? So like you have legal justice. And of course, this is not this crime against Chuck maybe isn't necessarily like something that could be prosecuted in a court of law, but it is a cosmic justice, right? By confessing that he did this to his brother and is taking responsibility for it. There is karmic justice there, perhaps. And then right after this courtroom scene, we get the flashback with Chuck. So the Chuck scene is sandwiched between the courtroom confession that what he did was a crime, and his the ride on the bus to the penitentiary. And this scene, I've already alluded to it. I've already talked, not even just alluded, I've talked about it already at length. The standout line for me in this exchange with Chuck is that if you don't like where you're headed, this is what Chuck says to Jimmy, if you don't like where you're headed, you can always go back and change your path. And of course, that's exactly what Jimmy does in this episode. He finally finds that path back to being himself, to being Jimmy McGill, and to owning up to what he has done and facing the music. And of course, at the end of that Chuck scene, we get the reveal of H.G. Wells' The Time Machine, the book that we saw earlier this season, both in the cold open to Wine and Roses and on his bedside table in Carrot and Stick. So this is a book that Chuck was reading that Jimmy inherited, I'm assuming, or borrowed, or if it was lost in the fire, maybe he purchased it for himself because he saw that his brother had it. And then the bus scene. I know that the bus scene is somewhat polarizing among fans. Some people thought it was really cringe and cheesy. Some liked it. I was in the latter camp. I liked it. And I already mentioned this before. I don't recall if I mentioned this on the Pete Peppers live stream, but I certainly mentioned this in my conversation with Anton when the prisoner first turns around and he's like, "Do I know you?" And Jimmy looks scared, right? He's scared. He's on this bus full of hardened criminals. And the guy's like, "Better call Saul." And he says, "Jimmy McGill," the name's McGill. And that reminded me of his encounter with Jeff at the mall, right? When Jeff approaches him and he's like, "You're Better Call Saul." And he's like, "The Takovic. So it's a analogous scene here. And of course, Jeff turned out to be pretty harmless, right? He really was just a fan. He admired him. And all these criminals on this bus with him, he's intimidated. They all have these deep, booming voices. And they're, the guy behind him is like, "Psst, psst, yeah, Better Call Saul." And you can see that Jimmy's a little bit afraid, but he has no reason to be. These are his fans. And more than that, I think this is Jimmy really reconciling with the fact that he is a criminal. He is one of them. So just like Mike in that scene with Nacho's father in Fun and Games at the fence when they're talking and Manuel calls him out. He's like, "You're all the same." And that's when Mike realizes he really is just another gangster. So maybe he's a gangster with a heart of gold, right? Maybe Jimmy is a criminal with his good attributes, but he's still a criminal, and he's no different from these guys on the bus. But moreover than that, the showrunners are letting us know and letting Jimmy know, you're going to be okay, right? Like, you are the John Dillinger of the Metropolitan Detention Center here. He's going to be okay. And and then following this scene is when we see him in the kitchen, and life isn't too different from the life he was leading in Omaha, Nebraska. So we get a shot that's very similar to what we've seen him doing, pulling like Cinnabons out of the oven. We see him pulling bread out of the oven, so he has useful skills. And moreover, though, he gets to be himself, right? Like, he doesn't need to hide. He doesn't need to look over his shoulder. Granted, he doesn't have his freedom. He's not free to move about. But what kind of life was it in Omaha, really? Like, he was terrified all the time. And here he is finally able to breathe again and to just be himself. And he has nothing really to worry about anymore. And so then when the guard comes in and says, your lawyer's here, man, I burst into tears again. So like burst into tears because who else was it? They're going to end the show with Oakley? I don't think so. So, yeah. So that final scene with Kim and how she shows up and she, did the same thing that she did when she went to go see Lalo, misrepresents herself a little bit so she can gain access, and they share a cigarette and lean up against the wall. It's a callback to that the first time we see them share a cigarette in Uno in the garage of HHM. There's all the familiarity of their relationship, and you get the sense that these are still two people very much in love. And of course, Kim pulls out just one cigarette. She could have pulled out two, but she just pulled out one because she wanted to share it. And we get the only other color that we see in the Gene timeline on her lighter and on the end of the cigarette. And I've already spoken a little bit about this, but to me, that just means that the only hope that remains in his life, the only color that remains in his life at this point, the spark between him and Kim, right? It is a love that burns eternal. And so they share their cigarette, and she's impressed that he was able to talk it down to 7.5 years. And then she says 86. So he 86'd himself. And he did it to prove to her that he could change. And the one thing I think that he really truly regretted, maybe there's more than one regret, but I think the primary regret here is that things went so south with Kim. I love this moment. And I love how it's left ambiguous, right? Is this the last time they see each other? Or will she come back to see him? Will she work towards reducing his sentence, helping him to get out? It is up to us to decide individually as fans. So I am a hopeless romantic, and I would like to think that they stay in touch, that this is not the last time that they ever see each other or speak to each other. And then we see Kim being let out of the prison, and Jimmy standing behind the fence watching her, and he does his little finger guns. And yes, if you look closely, you'll see that she has them by her side as though they're holstered, maybe, but they're there. They're there. And she does look back as she walks away, the final shot before he disappears out of her view because of the side of the prison. She does look back. And the fact that she looks back, to me, is hopeful, because I take that to mean that it's not the last time that they're ever going to see each other. It's not like she's looking forward and not looking back. She is looking back at him. And it was a very, very emotional finale. I was really happy with how they closed it out. All things considered, with staying true to the characters, without taking any shortcuts or paying too much fan service. I thought they did this right. They ended this right. And what a phenomenal finale. I loved every second of it. So I think I'm going to wrap it up here. I have so many thoughts about this episode. But there's maybe I can make some more content. The Saul withdrawal is going to be real. And I just wanted to take a moment to thank you all very much for joining me this season and for watching my breakdowns and sharing your thoughts and your predictions and your comments. It has been quite a ride. Thank you for watching.